Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today, Connie. Look, you are a pioneering organisational psychologist I've longed to speak with. I read lots of your work. It's brilliant. And you are, of course, the founder of the Institute for Life at Work. I love that framing. I love that title.
Thank you.
You spent years, if not longer, looking at the hidden emotional architecture of our workplaces, helping us understand how people think, feel, what makes them tick, all to pointing towards, higher performing cultures. And in this conversation, we're going to focus on the topic of loneliness at work. I felt lonely at work at different times. I know many of my C-suite clients and former colleagues have too, whether they've shared that or not. But I think many of us haven't known what to do with it, how to deal with it, how to think of it. And we're going to change that right here, right now in this conversation. But before we do, let me welcome you to the show. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So as we do in these conversations, let's start right at the top. Let's frame the conversation. I mean, you've moved loneliness from being a topic about us as individuals, and of course it is, but one front and center in organizations. And when somebody says loneliness at work, what do you think about when you hear that phrase?
Well, I love the fact you've invited me to start with the definition, because nothing a scholar loves more than doing is starting off with clearly defining the definition in the domain we're talking about. So thanks for the question. We define loneliness as the distressful experience of receiving a less positive social experience at work than desired. So lots of sort of jargon in there, but just want to break down a few of the key aspects. The first and most important one to understand is this word distress that's in the definition. And this definition has been created through years of work with my colleague, Sarah Wright from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And we think this is a step forward in understanding loneliness, because previously definitions did kind of muddy it up, whether it was just being alone or whether it was just this sort of cognitive gap between what I want and what I receive. And we really think that we have to accentuate that emotional response, that sense of distress. It's a signal in your body. It's a signal from organizations that something's wrong. And so the way that the other parts of the definition, though, that do matter is this gap idea. So we all have our own needs for socializing and social connection at work. And people are wide ranging in that. And that's completely part of our understanding of it. It is not to say that there is one version of what being socially connected looks like for everybody. It may depend on aspects like your personality, your upbringing. It may depend on how much other stuff you have going outside of work. I mean, a lot of people just don't have the bandwidth to engage socially with their colleagues. That's all fine. You're not lonely unless whatever that threshold is, you're below it. So you could be, for example, in an environment where people seem to be socializing quite actively, but it's not enough for you. Or you could be in an environment where people really aren't socializing at all, but it's sufficient. You don't need more than that. So it's a very subjective experience, which is one of the reasons why it's been so hard for organizations and leaders to get a handle on it. It's not a clean-cut, objective type of experience that they can just sort of go around and monitor and quickly calculate. It requires each person being able to self-reflect on what they need and what they're getting, and being able to come forward honestly and report it. So there are barriers that I think in understanding and in measurement that have gotten in the way of this becoming a more known and appreciated issue before now. But we've made great progress over the last few years, and COVID helped accelerate the research on it as well. So I'm happy to report that more and more, as you said, leaders are saying this is a problem that we need to address in our companies.
What a great definition. So clear, crisp. And you cover the arc of the conversation so beautifully. We can stop right here, right now. But let's not. But it's interesting. Just one reflection is, I think people often are quite lazy when they talk about loneliness and they group it with other terms, as you say, like being alone. I've heard people sort of mix loneliness and being an introvert, but also loneliness in a sense of, I guess, laziness as well, in the sense of people, you're not quite on the program, you're not quite with us. I mean, what is it? Is it the fact that people just don't know what it means, or is it just the fact that people tend to make assumptions about what loneliness implies about a person?
I think we carry with us a lot of stereotypes of who are lonely and what that looks like. I mean, I think I always say, like, we're grown adults, right? We're living in organizations, but we all kind of hark back to the middle school days at times. And we think about like what the person was in our grade who seemed to be lonely and had no friends. We pitied that person. They looked different. They acted different. They sat by themselves in the cafeteria. So I think we continue to kind of have that image in our mind. And a lot of leaders have those images in their mind when they address this. But it's so much more prevalent than that stereotype. It's so much more universal in terms of people's different backgrounds. We do work even with people, very senior people experiencing loneliness. And so there's stereotypes, as I said, that I think mislead people. Even I've talked to people who didn't know they were lonely until they had a conversation with me. And we're able to sort of help them understand that's why they were feeling this sense of disquiet at work or disliking their job. It really wasn't about the job. It wasn't about the company they were working for. It wasn't about the industry, their role. It was just they didn't feel connected to other people and they couldn't put their finger on it. So, because again, they're like, wait, I have friends, like they don't want to admit that. So it's kind of, I think we've got to break out of that idea of what loneliness looks like in order to really address it, because it prevents us from realizing when we are lonely and doing something about it. And it prevents us from recognizing this is a common issue that everybody, might face at some point, but it's certainly a common issue in most organizations. I mean, Gallup's latest global workforce report said 1 in 5 people were lonely the day before at work. In my own most recent study of 1,000 people, we find that 47% of people are moderately or highly lonely at work on a regular basis. So this is a really common thing. It's not just that one person that you remember in middle school in the cafeteria. And so I think that's
I'd also say that the return to the office sort of push that many large corporates is not necessarily the solution to it, because I've heard people talk about, hey, we're all, as you said, we're all together, we're all back, physically close to each other. Hey, surely that will address some aspects of loneliness.
Right. And Sarah and I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review last year, and that was one of the 4 myths that we tried to tackle, which is that remote work is the problem. And if we get everybody back to the office, it'll all be solved. And there are many reasons why that's not true, but just, to help people understand this, loneliness has been on the rise for the last couple decades at work. And this was before remote work was prevalent. So clearly there's some other aspect of being in an office that wasn't solving this problem. Yeah. But also we find that there are many people who are lonelier in the office because there's some aspect that reinforces this sense of being neglected or overlooked, that is more visible, more tangible in their face more when they're in the same office with other people and they're ignored when they walk down the hallway. So, sometimes it can exacerbate loneliness as well. Now, that being said, I will always caveat things. Our data most reliably over the last couple of years, if things have settled into more of a common hybrid orientation, is that, some in-person work does help on balance. People who have at this point in their work lives are never interacting with anybody in face-to-face do statistically show up as more lonely in our samples. Not much, but there is a trend there. But then when we get to hybrid, people who go in the office just 1 day a week, they're the same as people who go 5 days a week. So, I think we're also over medicating people with in-person time when, a smaller dose would be sufficient. But, it also, of course, it depends on the people and the type of work that they're doing. So there's a lot of other factors that can also get in the mix here when you're looking at, I can't tell every company what their policy should be on remote work, for example. There's so many other factors that matter.
No, I agree with that. Going back to your definition, you talked about obviously expectation and needs and the gap that people have, and obviously the emotional reaction to it. I guess the question that prompts me is, in a way, everyone's different, of course, but what is our reasonable expectation for a degree of connection at work? Is there from a practitioner perspective, a scholar perspective, is there a baseline that we should have before we can then think more about specific examples or people?
So Sarah and I developed a work loneliness scale. It's 5 questions. And I think the reason I want to raise that is because there's one question in particular that I think is a good marker of loneliness or not and why it matters. And that question is, I have enough people at work who have my back. And so, to your point, why does this matter? How do we know? Think about how hard we are all toiling in our jobs, usually for the benefit of the broader organization, our team, for the company itself, or the constituents and customers and clients that we serve. If we feel that we are doing this in a way where nobody is working on our behalf, helping us out if needed, being a resource of support, and we know social support comes in many different flavors. Some of it's just emotional support we may think about, but also having your back may be the person who comes and helps you on a project when you're on deadline and something goes wrong and you need that extra hand. If you really feel that there's nobody else in your organization that would step up for you in that way, you can see why it's such a painful experience. We're working so hard and nobody seems to care and want to help us. And, so it's a natural need, for humans to feel that they're part of a group that's mutually reinforcing and mutually supportive.
What would you say to a leader? And take a deep breath as I share this question. What would you say to a leader who would say, look, I get it to a degree, but look, I'm not a psychologist. Mm-hmm. I'm not an emotional caretaker. I'm not their father or mother or spouse or so on. There are limits. I mean, we're all adults here. What would you say to that provocation?
I do get this question often, actually, and I welcome it.
Oh dear, I'm sorry. I'll ask another one.
No, I mean not from podcast hosts, but from actual leaders. I get that question all the time, and I do welcome it because one of the things that we're trying to do here is open up the conversation. And if people are cynical about it and don't speak up, then we're never going to solve these issues. And so bring on your cynicism, bring on your concerns, bring on the worries that you have about somehow becoming a therapist to your employees or somehow coddling to the point where you can't perform. All reasonable concerns, but I would say that they're missing the mechanisms that drive the same outcomes they're looking for, like productivity, like retention of your best employees, like creativity. All those things actually start with people being able to do their best work. And going back to what I just talked about, with when you feel like someone has your back, it propels you forward. You're more motivated, you're more confident, you're more also, by the way, being able to leverage other people around you helps you do the work better and more productively. So, time and again, I'll say to them, if you tell me what you're looking for, what outcome are you looking for? And I can show you how the actually feeling that level of social connection will drive you towards those outcomes. It does not mean relaxing standards. It does not mean we all sit around and spend time just socializing. It doesn't mean we spend exorbitant budgets on like grand retreats. It just means embedding it into the day-to-day work, this prioritization on people being able to talk to each other about the work stuff and about whatever non-work stuff they want to bring forward that's relevant to the work. That actually is how you get the work done better. So, I've almost stopped in our surveys collecting things like job satisfaction and intention to quit, because the data comes back the same every time. It is one of the biggest predictors of someone's total overall job satisfaction is not their remote work pattern. It's not how long they've been in the job. It's not a whole bunch of other factors. It's how socially connected they feel to their colleagues. It explains a tremendous amount of variance. Same thing, much more likely to plan to quit in the next 6 to 12 months if they don't have that level of social connection. So it's a real factor there that has the business rationale, I think, behind it is why it matters. Of course, I also believe it matters just as terms of trying to improve humanity and improve the world we live in. But, even if you don't buy into that, it's okay. If all you care about are the bottom line results, like I've got a reason for you to care about this.
If you were speaking with a leader in one of these conversations and in simple terms, they felt they had a loneliness issue in their team, and before they wanted to encourage the conversations you just talked about, what sort of typical signs would they look for? What would they look to observe? Again, without making value judgments about people show up in lots of different ways, have different needs. But if you had to say, look, spend some time with your team, what are you sensing? And say, what would be on their shopping list?
I would say this is one of those situations where you'd have to almost be a professional ethnographer to figure it out by observation. And by that, I mean, it is a very hidden subterranean experience. And unless you are trained in how to look for it, you probably won't see it, or you'll read the wrong signs. Mm-hmm. We are so good at faking our way through work. We're so good at avoiding the stigma of being seen as someone who's lonely at work. So it will not show up in the, you might see it. You might see it in ways that mislead you. So, for example, you might think that the people who are really social in the meeting before the meeting gets started are not lonely. It may not be. They may be just knowing how to interact in a very superficial way with others. On the other hand, you might find that the people who routinely turn down your invitation to go to lunch or coffee with them are not lonely. Those people are actually more likely to be lonely. So it's the kind of phenomenon that I really recommend you have to directly assess by talking to the people. Again, this is subjective nature of it. Now, that's tricky to do because, of course, with all the stigma, people don't volunteer this information. So, we really do recommend use our 5-question survey or some other method that would allow you to get underneath what's really going on. Asking people more for example, you can do a survey, or you can have conversations with people. We ask things like, tell me a story about when you really looked out for somebody else here at work. Or tell me a story when someone really looked out for you. If they can't come up with those kinds of stories, then that's a signal that there's this lack of connection. But if you don't make it a safe space in which to have those conversations, they'll probably just cover it up as well and continue to cover it up.
So that's I know you've written about and obviously collaborated with Amy on sort of psychological safety. Right. That sort of that piece around, if you like, talking about the context that they're operating, the culture they're in, how they're sensing as a sort of maybe an invitation, yes, for some people, but actually it's saying, hey, it's not a sort of directly, how lonely are you? Tell me, how are you feeling? Sort of stuff, which would be, even for people who are lonely and even the most confident people would be like, how dare you? Restore a response. But your point is start at the bigger, broader picture and then see what comes.
Yeah, I developed this, I'll get back to psychological safety in a minute, but I developed this framework to kind of help guide organizations. I use the acronym UNITE because I do want to sort of, the goal here isn't just to eradicate loneliness, it's actually to bring people together. So the framework I, wanted to use to help organizations understand the process involved here. The first one is U is for understanding. And so really getting up to speed on, again, like looking at my data or other people's data about how prevalent this is. So operate under the assumption this is happening in your organization to begin with. So really understanding ways that you can tell whether it's there or not, but just knowing that this probably is. The second one is normalizing. So that's really normalizing the conversation. And that's where the psychological safety has to come in. And so the same principles about creating psychological safety, which is the comfort to speak up about any kind of interpersonal risky area. So it could be admitting mistake, or in this case, admitting you're lonely. That's a really important foundation to normalize that conversation. So one tip would be for leaders to acknowledge their own times when they've been lonely, to make that something that's relatable to other people instead of looking at it as like your problem versus my problem.
Yes.
The next thing though is the I in my framework is I is for investing. So, I'm sure you're going to get to this, but just to go through the full framework at first, put some money into it then when you discover these problems. Don't ask people for answers and then do nothing with that information. And then the T would be trial and error. So really sort of thinking about like, what are the experiments you can do? And then the E is evaluate. So this is the same kind of problem as any other change management initiative in an organization. You need the full spectrum from understanding to evaluation to repeating that cycle over and over again until you've addressed the problem. And so I want people to understand that although this is one of the most difficult problems to discern, it is not the most difficult problem to solve. And the same practices of data-driven analysis and experimentation will hold true.
It's a very powerful framework and a tool. And I guess for some people listening, they may be in fairly mercenary, high-paced, individualistic cultures and think, hey, we haven't we don't have the time, we don't have the inclination. It's all about the short-term KPIs, whatever the particular excuse being. You're saying, well, there is a way of dealing with it. And actually you do, I think you referred to sort of slack, psychological slack. You have to create some capacity in the system for people to learn, express themselves, and say what they need.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, humans don't connect in an instant. There has to be some time. And in what we've seen, particularly for people who are already lonely, they're harder to connect with. So you need time, but you also need repeated touch points, that regular routine. And so if you think about that's the way to increase connection is regular, repeated, standardized kind of times and ways for people to connect. Then where's that come from? There has to be an adjustment in the workflow, or otherwise it won't happen. And you also, by the way, we have another article that I wrote with Nancy Bain from Microsoft. You also have to have organizational rewards attached to doing those things. So yeah, again, it's you need to think about this doesn't happen. It should not happen in the early morning, the late night, or the weekends. If creating a more connected workforce is an organizational priority, the organization should make that possible and pay people for it. I feel very strongly about that. So,
no, I agree.
So, put your money where your mouth is on that. That's the investment part. And so incorporate things into the workday, carve out time, make it okay, push back that deadline by a few hours so you can have a 1 hour lunch together or whatever it is. You need to make sure that the system itself is facilitating these contact points.
That's a brilliant point. I spoke in another conversation with Michael Watkins about the first 90 days, the first 100 days, obviously 90 days being his brand of leaders. And there is a tendency it's all about effort, to focus on effort, energy, push. Come on, let's go. Out of everything you've just said there, if you were advising a new CEO and you had to say to her or him, look, we know there's a connection issue in the team or the organization you're in. Yes, you need a whole system to look at it, but there's one thing, only one thing you need to really focus on in your first few days in your role in this context of there's a lack of connectivity in the organization. What would you call out to her or him?
I think the most important thing in those first 90 days would be to really clarify the why. Why do you, new CEO, believe that this is worth people's time and effort? We're all profit maximizers for ourselves and for, how we spend our energy. And this is why I don't think loneliness can be solved from the bottom up. I think it has to have the mandate and the faith from the top to say that this is worth it. So it could be manifested in many different ways. Maybe the first 90 days, there aren't a lot of lunches, because they're working on other things. But if it's not part of that priority list and there's not a clear reason why that person thinks it's going to be worthwhile to invest, it really won't. It won't happen except in small pockets of intrepid individuals who make it happen on their own. They find their own small group. They find their, and individual teams can achieve this. But if you're not talking about it and if you're not connecting it to a clear outcome that you value, then it's just more words.
Absolutely on point. If you were to look to the future now, and you looked at either certain disruptions or trends or developments that could influence loneliness and obviously its impact on organizational performance. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about variations of AI and how that impacts. That's one topic. But what would be on your list of things thinking, you know what, as a researcher and a thinker in this space, I'm really going to be watching out for this in terms of its influence on loneliness? What would be what would you be considering?
It's absolutely AI. I have multiple projects going on right now about the impact of AI on interpersonal relationships. And a big flagship one that Sarah and I will be writing up in the next couple months is just looking at the way AI is interacting with human relationships, but also we're really looking at the way people are interacting and developing relationships with AI. And we don't even have like agents really in large scale at this point, but even just generative AI conversational chatbots. It's amazing to me how many people are receiving the same kinds of human-like support that they used to get from their colleagues from AI.
Yes. Yes.
And so we have this sample of 1,000 US knowledge workers, and we find that 17% of them say that AI is making them less lonely, which
Wow.
on the one hand sounds like a miracle cure, right? You know, that we can somehow address this through technology. But I worry a lot about the long-term implications of that. We do have another, it's around 5% of people in our study who say that AI is making them more lonely. And what they're saying is that it's displacing my conversations that I would have had with other people. Yeah. And I believe that as we inject more talented, robust AI agents and eventually super agents into the mix, you'll see those teams being comprised of a mixture of agents and humans. And every sort of step away from the kind of collaboration that involves human-human contact, I think presents a risk for increased loneliness. Now, again, this is early days, so we don't know. And I take some comfort in the fact that people are getting social support somewhere, you know? So it's not like, you know, I think this is just all doom and gloom, but, you know, what does it mean if we get to the point where 75% of people say that I interact with AI instead of other people at work, and I feel less lonely because I've got my AI buddy with me at all times? I have some worries about that. So we're really trying to understand, like, you know, when is this helpful? When is it not helpful? And we'll continue to be studying this as things evolve.
Fascinating. What's your relationship with loneliness?
Well, professionally, it's funny. I have to stop sort of, I feel like, positioning myself as a social connection researcher, because I'm becoming more and more known for the opposite of the loneliness. But really, that's where I started. You know, my relationship with loneliness came indirectly. I was more focused on how do people survive doing really difficult, emotionally charged jobs, like ER doctors or special education teachers, when I started off for my dissertation. And I found the way people were able to do those jobs was through the social support of their peer group. And so that really cued me into what a connection there was between this interpersonal relationship that people had and their psychological and emotional well-being at work. But then over time, as I studied more and more of these types of work settings, it became clear that not everybody had that. And then there were a few other catalyzing studies that were done in the area of work loneliness, including some of Sarah's work, that made me realize, like, you know, it's not as if the people were neutral or had good relationships. We realized there were a lot of people who have really like a real gap, a real absence, that distress attached to a lack of relationships. And when the trend line started going upwards in that regard, like, it called me to action. So that's my professional relationship with loneliness. But I also have a personal one. I was a kid who moved around a lot, and we moved different states, often in the middle of the year, which is really hard. And so I experienced loneliness regularly as a child, and had to figure out ways for me to bond quickly with people so that I would, you know, be able to survive myself. So I understand also at a really visceral level what it's like to be lonely.
I appreciate you sharing that. What would you say your superpower is?
You know, this one I've been thinking about a lot lately, because it involves, I feel growth on my part of trusting how my brain works more. I've always been someone who's like really good at doing deep research. I really love getting into the weeds and looking at all the data. And, you know, people would say that I spend probably too much time on data analysis. But I realized more and more that I can kind of switch off my brain and go into like almost a meditative state and see the forest for the trees in a way that I think I didn't trust for a while. And I thought, you know, it was the kind of thing I have to do more work to come up with these, you know, we talked about in consulting, like the so what, like what's the so what of all this analysis. And I realized that more and more, like I can, it's in my brain. I may not be able to directly show how I got to this idea, but I have to trust that the ideas are there and just let them bubble up.
That's very powerful. And what about your biggest weakness?
My biggest weakness, I would say, is sort of I have a very loose governance system on what I say yes to that I really should tighten up to avoid doing as much as I do. It's a version of the can't say no thing, but I they say the answer to that problem is to just be really clear about your criteria for saying yes. I have really clear criteria, but my criteria is not very stringent. So I think I need to improve that. My criteria basically is do I think this is interesting? Do I like the people that I'd be working with? And then do I think I could contribute? But turns out that doesn't sift out too many things. And so I end up being a bit overloaded. I think I have 12 different projects going on right now. And, it really is, it is too much. So I'm going to have to work on figuring out another criterion that will be a little better for my sort of workload. But so far, I feel so incredibly blessed. I've these opportunities, and having started my own research institute, I have even more autonomy to just follow the path of what's interesting with good people. And overall, it's been a huge blessing.
Yeah. And clearly that governance process has worked very well in selecting this podcast to come on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at a more philosophical level, with all the 12 projects and more and more and more, what impact are you looking to have on the world around you through your work?
Gosh, I just want to be a voice for the people, I guess. I want to be someone that can help amplify what's going on the ground in organizations in a way that leaders can hear it, be persuaded by it, and act upon it. And so for me, that starts with having data. And using that to display problems and hopefully provide solutions. So I guess I really want that kind of impact, sort of starting from the bottom, but really reaching the top in a way that will change people's lives. The reason I call the Institute for Life at Work is that I'm really pro having a good life at work and not separating work life, into work-life balance or other, types of dichotomies. And, I think more and more this feels like it's so important to do this. I think we're, particularly with the advent of AI, we're in danger of losing sight of the value of those people doing the work.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. And when you're having your best day, those days we think, everything's flowing. I'm getting through all the projects. Mm-hmm. I'm just getting into the data and looking at the big picture. Everything's working. What habits or practices do you use to help you perform at your best?
Well, I try to do time blocking. I think that's a big thing for me because I do get otherwise swept away. I did some research on meetings, so I know how valuable it is to have those 2 or 3 hours, open blocks for deep thinking work in the day instead of just at night or on the weekends. So that's a big part of it. With this writing project that we're about to do on the AI and loneliness research, I'm already starting to carve out big blocks of time in my calendar that I'll try to protect. So I think that's a big aspect of when I'm doing my best work. And then just, I try to apply that also. For me, I should say, I'm not the most extroverted person in the world, but I understand both intrinsically as well as from the data, how important social connection is. So I try to also time block out and have regular occasions built into the calendar for me to socialize or be with family members. And last night, I had my monthly Zoom call with my college roommates. And so, that also fuels me as well. So I feel like I'm doing my best when I'm not just working, but I'm sort of balancing the different needs that I have socially and professionally, but in a way that doesn't make me feel, that makes me feel more in control. And I can really focus and dedicate during that time.
That sounds very intentional. And as we draw this conversation to the close, at least this conversation, I hope there'll be more in the future. What final message would you have to listeners, perhaps listeners who are feeling lonely at work or perhaps sense loneliness in their team?
I think I would say that although in this conversation I've really accentuated the responsibility and the opportunity at the senior level, that I wouldn't want people to leave here thinking they have to wait for their leader to declare a campaign, anti-loneliness campaign. I think I would say to people, look at the data. You can take the self-assessment test. It's free online. See where you stand. And then also know that the others around you probably are also struggling with loneliness. And so reach out. There's lots of great research that talks about just the power of a 10-minute conversation with someone to make you feel happier, make them feel happier, make you feel more connected. You don't have to create an elaborate sort of system for yourself. I want the organizations to really build a whole system, but for you as an individual, carve out 10 minutes. Just find 10 minutes to reach out to someone. I find people are overwhelmingly gratified to have that genuine social contact initiated by someone else to them. And then that can hopefully help them reach out to someone else.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Where can people find out more about you and your brilliant work?
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think, the easiest way would be the Institute for Life at Work website. And I encourage people to go there and connect with us too. And there's emails there that they can reach out if they want more. I'm on LinkedIn as well, and I have a faculty page at the BU Questrom School of Business. So any of those opportunities, I welcome people's input and interest in our work.
I love in this conversation how you've practiced your superpower. It feels like we've gone deep in terms of the definition of loneliness, what it is, what it isn't. We've got into some of the sort of mindsets and practices people can use in the frameworks and tools in terms of the really practical bit. And I guess we broadened it out in terms of what it means for connection, performance, and humanity. Mm. So the big picture and the small picture. So we've applied your superpower and I've gone on the ride with you. What a great conversation. I also appreciate how you've called out positively and transparency the people you work with, which is not always the case. It says something about your spirit and so forth. You. So what a great conversation. So thank you for your time, Connie.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.